All right, I guess it's showtime. I want to thank Steph, Joe, and everyone for decorating the room so nicely for Forum today. There also happens to be a pancake brunch. I hope you can make it for that. My wife and I are both looking forward to that. And if you want to throw any Mardi Gras beads my way, we can get into that later. But I guess we should get started. Well, good morning, everyone. We're heading into a week of warmer weather, which is going to be fun, and maybe the mountains of snow along Duke Street and elsewhere will start to melt. I parked next to one this morning, and it's really kind of like a mountaineering thing, trying to get alongside your car and not go under it. So anyway, thanks for coming out this morning. Well, this morning we're turning to the passages which explicitly raise our theme about loving enemies. But we looked last week at the Old Testament and the rabbinic tradition just to overcome an impression that Jesus clearly gives, which is that either the law of Moses or the rabbis of his day were teaching that we should love our neighbor and hate our enemies. And that's simply not true. However, that's the way human beings live, right? So I think what he might be picking up is that's the way we think. We should love those who love us and we should hate those who hate us. That certainly seems to be the way of the world. So he may also just be picking up a kind of a proverb kind of thing, but it's not actually in the Old Testament. It's not actually in the rabbinic tradition. And in fact, the rabbis are very concerned about two issues. One is, and they're related, one is bearing a grudge and the way that leads to the desire to take vengeance. And so they warn repeatedly not to ruminate over the wrongs that were done to you, because that will then lead you to take possibly violent action against your neighbor, or maybe just to retaliate in other ways. Like the example the Rabbi Rashi gave of somebody says, "Can you loan me your shovel?" and he says no. And then the next day the person who said no comes to him and says, "Can I borrow your axe?" And he said, "Well, you wouldn't lend me your shovel. I'm not going to lend my axe to you." And that's taking vengeance, right? And so they're very concerned about both of those things. But they don't teach, and in fact, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who is the rabbi of Great Britain, wrote a really interesting piece on this, and he said, rabbis and Jews overall think Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies goes too far. It's actually a dangerous teaching, and it pushes things too far. People can't do it, and it causes psychological and social harm if you try. So it's not like we're on agreement on this. The command to love enemies is something distinctively Christian and is not found in the Jewish or Old Testament traditions. But it doesn't mean that they teach hatred of enemies either. But what I want to do today is look at the teaching of Jesus, obviously, on this issue, and especially to set it in context. Like, why would he be focusing his disciples on their attitude toward their enemies? And the reason is very simple, that he saw his movement as creating enmity. His movement creates enmity. Like, he's not talking about people hating us just because they find us to be a jerk. That happens to me all the time. But anyway, I know you find that hard to believe, but anyway, so it's not just general hatred, which we have plenty of, but the hatred he's talking about here is hatred because you follow him. And so what would it be about following Jesus that would generate hatred and enmity? So I have passages from the Gospel of Matthew at the very beginning to sort of focus that discussion. It's right after, in Matthew 10, he's called the 12 disciples and he sends them out for the first time and tells them not to go to the Gentiles at this point, but just to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then he warns them. He said, "I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves." So that already we know there's danger out there, right? And we're defenseless, by the way. "So be wise as serpents," so you have to be wise, "and innocent as doves." And then he goes on to say, this division, this enmity will be in families, right? He says, "Sibling will betray sibling to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death." And then this is the line, "and you will be hated by all because of my name." So the name of Jesus will cause people to hate you because you follow him. And this hatred will run through families intergenerationally. but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Then he warns them again. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes or one's enemies will be members of one's own household. So the enmity that is being generated or spoken of here is enmity because you follow Jesus. And you will generate this enmity, he's warning his disciples, in your own families, right? And he said, that's why I came. I came to generate this kind of enmity. And that, I bet you don't hear many sermons on this, right? So the Prince of Peace came not to bring peace, but a sword. It's really interesting, actually. And then toward the end of the gospel, when they're talking about the end days, it's after he tells them that the temple will be destroyed. He warns them now that this enmity will be in the nations themselves into which they'll be sent. He says in 24:4, when they ask him what the signs of the end will be, Jesus answers them, beware that no one leads you astray. They will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death. And we don't know who they are. It's kind of interesting. And you will be hated by all nations because of my name. So you get the same line that you got in chapter 10, but it says, you will be hated by all because of my name. Now it's, you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and the people who fall away are disciples, by the way, and will betray one another and hate one another. So the disciples will get to a point where they fall away and betray each other and actually start hating each other, which is pretty shocking, right? And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold, and the many would be his disciples. So this enmity will also emerge in the community of disciples, that their love will grow cold, and many of them will start hating each other and betraying each other. So it's not like he's expecting some big Valhalla, peace conference kind of thing, that the enmity that will be probably in Israel that they'll experience in chapter 10, they'll experience from the nations in chapter 24, and they'll also experience internally between each other. So the hatred and the enmity that he's warning us against is internal, right? And it's unavoidable because it stems from following Jesus. Why would people hate you for following Jesus? And if people don't hate you, this is Kierkegaard's question, if people don't hate you, are you following Jesus, right? Because one of the signs that he says repeatedly is if you follow me, people will hate you and they'll persecute you and revile you and try to hand you over to death and may succeed in doing so. So that's the context. I think it's really interesting to keep that in mind because you'd think he'd say, so you better buy some swords, and get ready and go to training camp and things like this. But then instead, that's where the command to love your enemies comes from. It's in a context in which his disciples are vulnerable to attack, right? They're vulnerable to this very divisive climate that they're going to be creating by following him. So I thought just to change things up, it would be interesting to switch over to the Gospel of Luke, because the command to love our enemies is best known from the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, but it comes across differently, it seems to me, in the Gospel of Luke. This is what they call the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus preaches pretty much the same message, but it's not on a mountain. And so I thought it would be interesting to see how this teaching sounds from the Gospel of Luke. And again, it's in the context of calling the first disciples, and they're all named there, including Judas, the one who betrayed him. And then he looked up at his disciples. This is about 3 paragraphs in the bottom. He looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you when people hate you." I'm just going to stop there. Blessed are you when people hate you. Right? And when they exclude you and revile you and defame you, not because you're a jerk, but on account of the Son of Man. So when they hate you and exclude you and revile you and defame you because you follow him, right? Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. for that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. So you can see right there, we have a very different affective world that Jesus is expecting from us, that when we're hated, excluded, reviled, and defamed, we rejoice. That's really, I mean, that's quite a trick to pull off, actually, right? And our reward will be great in heaven, even though things aren't going to go very well here. And then he turns to the command that we are studying in this section of Forum. But I say to you who are listening, and you can imagine by now, their disciples are like, you know what? I forgot I have a dental appointment. I'm going to go rejoice with my root canal. Okay. But anyway, but I say to you who are listening, love your enemies. And Luke gives more detail actually than Matthew does. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. So these are very concrete things. And it's really helpful actually if you're in a situation of conflict where you're really tempted to hate someone, doing the other things rather than just focusing on changing your attitude, which is really hard to do the other things, right? Do good to them, bless them, pray for them, especially pray for them, right? If you have somebody that you really are tempted to hate, pray for them. It changes you. It really does. Just to say their name changes you, let alone say their name in a prayer of blessing. Pray for them the way you would for a dear family member, right? And maybe they were a family member and now they hate you, but pray for them like they were a family member, etc. So I think it's really important to remember when he says love your enemies, he always adds all these other things that help make that possible and also manifest it. Because you could say you love your enemies, but not pray for them. You could say you love them, but you won't do any good for them. I love you, but you can go hungry, right? Um, uh, and bless them who curse you. That's really hard, right? To bless somebody who's cursing you. And then he gives more examples of how this would manifest itself. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. So learn how not to retaliate. Right? We'll look at the very end of this series at Martin Luther King Jr., and he took this very seriously, but man, it is really hard to learn how to do that, to learn how not to retaliate. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. In the culture of Jesus's day, that's all you had to wear was a shirt and a coat. And so if they took your coat and you let them take your shirt, you have no clothing. Right? So it's incredible voluntary vulnerability that he's asking us for, actually telling us. These are all in the imperative. This isn't you might, you should, all that. It's no, you do this. Give to everyone who asks of you, and if anyone takes away what is yours, do not ask for it back again. Les Miserables is built entirely on an incident where a priest does not seek to punish the man who stole from him, and it transformed their whole world, right? Do not ask for it back again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. But that would include for him all of these different things. So loving your enemies includes doing good to those who hate you, blessing those who curse you, praying for those who mistreat you, turning the other cheek when somebody hits you, not withholding your clothing when somebody steals it from you, giving to people who ask it of you, and also letting them take things without seeking justice in response, and do to others as you would have them do to you. What I like about Luke is he repeats this theme, because I think Luke knows this is pretty stern stuff, right? This is not the easiest message to hear. So then Jesus says, which he says in Matthew, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? And I don't know what your experience of the church is, but my experience of the church is pretty much we love those who love us, right? And don't really love people that don't love us. But that's up to each of us to answer that question. For even sinners love those who love them. And no one would argue with that. The Old Testament would completely agree with that. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And then Luke is very interested in money. Luke thinks that what we do with our money reveals everything about us. And so he's going to add another one. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive payment, what credit is that to you? So for Luke, you're supposed to lend without ever expecting it back. And not as a big martyring thing, like, an okay, you don't ever have to repay me, that kind of drama thing. No, it's like, no, you lend by giving it. You're not lending. Jesus would be horrified by banks and interest rates and things like that. The Christian tradition was against usury for a very, very, very long time. And it was only actually the Protestants in the colonies decided that maybe usury could be a good thing because then money can make money and then we can beat the Roman Catholics at their game. But anyway, that's a long story. But it's interesting to realize that in the Christian tradition, bearing interest was a bad thing, right? It was forbidden. So if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive payment, what credit is that to? So notice how complex his critique of the way we love each other is. Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again, let alone to receive more again. Instead, love your enemies, right? So here it comes again. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he himself is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So I think that this is, and then I'll just add this part again to finish up with Luke. Then he adds another thing that goes with loving your enemies. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Right? So one of the things we love to do, I will be exhibit A, is judge. Right? Which is why watching the Olympics is so much fun. My wife and I love it. There's a phrase in the Olympics that some of the people get very precious and they're like, oh, that mistake on that skate, she left the door wide open for the competition. So, we love to judge and say, ooh, that was a nasty mistake. That's going to cost them. That's going to cost them. We don't really like so much. That was beautiful. And what a beautiful performance. Like, no, they caught the blade there. But anyway, but do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Right? The implication clearly is if you judge, you will be judged. If you condemn, you will be condemned. In fact, in the Lord's Prayer, we have something that rolls off our tongue without our realizing just what a barb is in it. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And here it is again. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. But in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus teaches the disciples and us the Lord's Prayer, he adds one commentary at the end of it that you never hear in church. For I tell you, if you forgive the sins of others, the Father will forgive you. If you do not forgive the sins of others, God will not forgive you. Right? Full stop. So when we say, as we forgive those who sin against us, we mean we are forgiven to the degree that we forgive those who have sinned against us. Yes? And, yes, Jeff.
Just from the verses you have here, the question I have, Matthew seems to be doing these good things to get to heaven. Luke doesn't talk about that. He seems to be much more practical about doing these things to have a good life on earth. Is there something about the death or life after death that is a really big part of Jesus' teaching?
Well, that's a really good, I actually think they're both talking about the same thing because they both say your reward will be great in heaven.
I missed it. Part.
Okay, yeah, it would be, yeah. Oh, yeah, you're right. It says your reward will be great, but it doesn't say where. Yeah, I'm just reading Matthew into Luke, aren't I? Oh, no, it's in verse 20, it's in 22 and 23 in Luke 6. That's where I was thinking of it. Thank you. Yeah, blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. Right? And so it depends on what he means by heaven. And there's a huge argument about this in the early and later Christian tradition, because heaven seems to be a place you go when you die. That's when Jesus tells the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Paul talks about dying and going to be with the Lord in Philippians. And so that's 99.9% of the Christian imagination about heaven is that's where you go when you die. But that's actually not the primary teaching of Jesus. For Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is coming. It's not somewhere you go when you die. It's something that he's announcing is coming, and John the Baptist announced is coming. So it's the future coming into the present, right? And it's going to happen any day now in his mind. Yes. Yeah, it's now here and also it's coming. Right, right, exactly. But it's very much something in the future that's coming into the present, over which we have no control. So we also have another phrase we talk about a lot, just to make up for the gap, and we talk about building the kingdom of heaven. You will never find Jesus telling us to build the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is something God does. It's something only God can do. We can't do that, and it has no continuity with what we're doing. In fact, the kingdom is coming when people hate the disciples and hand them over to be killed, and they start hating each other and all that. Those are the signs of the end time. So for Jesus, rather than everything's getting better and better and suddenly voila, the kingdom, it's like, no, things just go to hell in a handbasket and then the kingdom, right? And if you hang on as his disciple until the kingdom comes, then you'll make it. But he doesn't think many people will hang on. So it's a really good question. What does he mean by your reward is great in heaven? Does it mean you will be rewarded after you die? Or does it mean you will be rewarded when the kingdom of heaven comes? It could mean both. It has come to mean, since the kingdom of heaven hasn't come in 2,000 years, that people have taken it to be that's where you go when you die. That's where the angels are, etc. And that's not wrong, because as I said, Jesus tells the thief, "You will be with me today in paradise." And Paul says, "It's better for me to die to go to be with the Lord." And the Lord hasn't come back yet. So it's a really good question. So it would be you suffer and you're reviled and you're hated, and in response you love and you bless and you do good, and you will be rewarded for that, but not in this life. So if you did it as a strategy to be better off in this life, then it would destroy everything he's trying to do here, which is it becomes a game you play and you're kind of gaming the system. But yeah, so
The author, why they wrote this the way it did, because you can't interpret the words a little differently, as you pointed out. And it seems that Matthew is much clearer about there being an afterlife. And I do wonder about whether the Jews believed in the afterlife at this time in history.
That's a really good question. So the question is, does Jesus's audience believe in the afterlife? The question would really be, do they believe in resurrection? And this is a dividing point at this time. The idea of resurrection arises in the Jewish tradition about 160 years before Jesus. It's not in the Torah. It's not in almost all of the Hebrew Bible. It's in one verse of the book of Daniel, and chapter 12. But it's especially prominent in Second Maccabees, when the Jews are martyred for simply adhering to the law of Moses, and they're put to death because they won't stop obeying Moses. So the idea of resurrection comes in at that point. It may come from Persian influences. It may just come from an internal theological insight. But by the time of Jesus, the Pharisees believe there is a resurrection. The Sadducees do not. And the Sadducees are the priests, and they're in charge of the temple. So they have the most authority, actually. The Pharisees are lay people. Jesus is a Pharisee, and Paul was a Pharisee. It's a lay movement of people teaching the law. And so Jesus believes in the resurrection. And then there's a similar idea at this point of eternal life, or immortal life is another way it's phrased. But that's not that. So these ideas are in the air, and Jesus clearly believes in resurrection, and his followers do too, obviously, because I think God raised him from the dead. But the Sadducees don't. So it could be that your reward will be great when God raises you from the dead. That could be one way of thinking. Although I think Jesus didn't think people were going to die before he came back and the kingdom came. So those are very good questions. And that's the context then, is that you're giving everything up in this life, but you're not just losing everything. But when you get it all back, you have no control over that, because that's up to God when God brings the kingdom, when the kingdom of heaven comes. Or that happens after you die, would be another way of viewing that. But what happens in this life is you are completely defenseless and you are completely non-retaliatory. And the early Christian movement was very much against serving as a soldier, for instance, in the Roman army, because how could you serve as a soldier and obey Jesus? How could you serve as a policeman and obey Jesus? How could you serve as a judge and obey Jesus? How could you be a jailer and obey Jesus? So the early Christian movement for a very long time, until basically Constantine, had nothing to do with criminal justice or warfare. They just thought, we can't obey Jesus and live that way. We are very fortunate, by the way, to be surrounded by people who still live this way, the Mennonites and the Amish. And they won't serve as police officers. They won't serve as judges. They won't pay taxes to support any of it. And they have a very complex relationship with the government where when they file their taxes, they sort out anything that would support violence, right? Anything that would support retaliatory behavior. And so this is still a small wing of the Christian tradition, still lives according to this. But most of us act like Jesus never said any of this. I mean, it's a scandal, right? It's like, where is this in our life together? Where do we hear this repeatedly? Love those who hate you, do good to those who revile you, etc. And especially if somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek, lend without expecting anything in return, etc. And Luke thinks, and it's really interesting, there's a New Testament scholar named Luke Timothy Johnson who did his dissertation on possessions in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts. And how people treat their possessions is a major theme in his gospel, and it's not in the others. So if you're rich, like Zacchaeus, my favorite one, Zacchaeus is a tax collector. And when he comes to faith in Jesus, he gives up all the wealth that he got by cheating, basically. And so he wouldn't just say, because tax collectors were very unscrupulous, which is why they weren't very much loved by their society. And so by restoring what he took from his neighbors, he shows that he sincerely believes in Jesus. And then Jesus says, you also are a child of Abraham, right? But how we dispose of our possessions, so lend without expecting anything in return, is part of the same teaching, love those who hate you. Right? It's all part of, or bless those who curse you, pray for those who persecute you, etc. It's all part of the same thing. And as I said, the early church for centuries was convinced that this meant we couldn't serve in the military, we can't serve as police officers, we can't serve as judges, etc., because we're judging and condemning and other things. Yeah, Sam.
I hate to ask, what are the federal consequences for the Amish who separate their tax?
None, because it's freedom of religion. Thank God for the First Amendment, right? So, no, that's why there's so many Amish and Mennonites in the United States, is that they view that, very interestingly, the way they parse that out is part of their religious expression, their religious practice, and they have full freedom to do that. In fact, that starts really early. William Penn knew that in the founding of Pennsylvania, and Roger Williams knew that in the founding of Rhode Island. And they explicitly mentioned the Anabaptists, that they can practice and the Quakers. Obviously, William Penn was a Quaker, and they didn't support the revolution because you'd have to fight a revolutionary war, and they didn't think they could do that. So the original colonies were already addressing this issue, and luckily, it made its way all the way into the First Amendment. So that's where it comes from. And it's not then taxed enough already, right? It's not a tax protest. They're willing to pay their taxes that they feel they can, but they won't pay taxes for things they can't support on religious grounds. The question is, what happened to the rest of us? Like, why wasn't that an issue for all of us? Why is that an Amish or a Mennonite issue? I mean, it's really in the early church, this was the unanimous position. No one disagreed with that. So it's really an interesting question. But yeah, so the federal government allows them to do that. And it is part of the freedom of religious expression and practice. And you can see that would be a really contentious one, because there would be other colonists who would say, well, they're not bearing their own load. They're free riders, and we have to defend them. And Penn got into a huge conundrum. We know this from here with the massacre that took place by the Paxton boys right here in our little down the street over by the Fulton, that the Quakers realized they couldn't defend themselves. And so they brought the Scots-Irish in to sort of take care of the frontier. And then they didn't get paid. You probably heard these stories. And then they marched on Philadelphia to get paid. I mean, it's a really interesting question in the context of our own country's history, the relationship of non-resistance and non-violence to the establishment of this country. But the Christians who followed this teaching could never have gone to war against King George III. Just would never have happened. And they didn't. They didn't. The Moravians also at this period were pacifists. And the one reason they got a pass was they turned their churches and other buildings into hospitals. And so they treated the wounded, but from both sides. They treated wounded English soldiers and they treated wounded patriots. But that was a way they managed to stay in George Washington's good graces, was that they ran basically field hospitals. But this was a huge issue during the Revolutionary era. Because if you can imagine, the people with whom you're in community, if you live like this, they're going to think you're selling everything out that they believe in. You're praying for Osama bin Laden. You're praying for Adolf Hitler. You're praying for Putin. You're doing good to them. You're not resisting them. You're blessing them. And you're rejoicing when they punish you. Are you insane? You are a traitor to everything we believe in. You betrayed us. You're dangerous. You're an enemy, right? I mean, this actually happens through history too. People who live this way are treated as treasonous, internal enemies. A very dear professor of mine at Yale Divinity School, that some of you may know, Roland Bainton, was a really great Reformation scholar. And pardon me?
Got peanut gallery in the back saying.
No, he's Quaker. Roland Bainton's a Quaker. Quaker. I won't retaliate, but he's a Quaker. And he would, yeah, it is very much so. And he was a conscientious objector in World War I. You can imagine how well that went over. And he was vilified. But he actually wound up serving as, I think, in the chaplain's office in France, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, he said he was reviled because of that. And it's like, you're not supporting the war cause. That song, Over There, the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. They didn't think it was going to be Roland Bain coming, right? This Quaker. So it's been a part of our history for a long time. And the people who live according to these teachings are viewed by their fellow Christians as really weird and kind of dangerous. Yes?
People, the conscientious objection during the Vietnam War, how did they prove that they were in a religion that felt that way? Could there not have been people who just wanted to get out of going to war? Yeah,
no. So the question is, during the Vietnam War, this was my generation, right? The conscientious objectors could seek the way Roland Bainton did. He was a conscientious objector. It was very easy for him because he was a lifelong Quaker. It wasn't easy because they were really upset with him, but he defended himself and lived that way. But in the Vietnam War, it wasn't just religiously based, it was conscience, right? And that's the American way. You have freedom of conscience. And so if your conscience tells you you can't fight in the Vietnam War or any war, then that's a defensible position, but you have to show that that's really your conscientious position. And so the draft boards, and of course, draft boards varied in quality, but the draft board would make you write a paper. It was like an ordination paper, actually. You'd write a paper and then you'd go and defend it. And a friend of mine was seeking to be a conscientious objector in Durango, Colorado. You can imagine how that flew, right? These cowboys, it was like, they're not happy with this. But he won, and he wasn't religious at that point. He was wasn't a member of any church, but he gave a very articulate position as to why he couldn't serve, right? And so they granted him that, which was different than the student exemption. And I was actually on my way to writing my own paper, and then I got my draft number. It was in the 200s. And I was like, oh, okay. And then then Nixon canceled the draft. So in a way, it was unfortunate I didn't have to defend my position, because as an Episcopalian, we're not pacifists, right? So they would say, where's this coming from? Yeah, Paul?
Mennonites that were conscious objectors, they just not have to go to war, they had to do alternate service.
Right, right.
So most of them worked like in mental hospitals and, other things that other people had left the field, so they did still work.
Oh, no, they served. Yeah, that was their service. No, absolutely. Oh, yeah, all the way through. No, that's absolutely, no, that's what I was saying. When Bainton won his exemption, he still had to serve. And that's what, as I was saying, the Moravians did the same thing. They basically acted as field chaplains and hospital maintainers. So they weren't indifferent to what was going on, but they were not going to kill. That was the main thing I was trying to say, yes.
Some of them, however, completely got out of service and didn't have to serve. I represented a conscientious objector who was already in the military, and he became a conscientious objector. It was in the early days. And I actually had to go to General Hershey, who was the person who ran the draft. And but you could get, there was a regulation that you could get an exemption. And this particular guy, even though he had an obligation, he was a pilot, and he served just the minimum amount of time he was supposed to serve more, and they left him out.
No, right. It depended on context. It depended on who the person was applying, and it depended on the board or the general in this case hearing the case. So no, it was very much. It wasn't one size fits all at all. And there were people who were turned down. I had friends who were also turned down because they were gaming the system. Like, I don't want to go to war. I'll be a conscientious objector, but I don't want to get too far afield on that, because the main theme is love your enemies. So, but yes, go.
One of the things that's very thought-provoking about all of this is instructional for the disciples and therefore for us. And I can certainly understand you are going to be reviled, pretty evident with the powers that will be in place, but I'm only beginning to now to understand the discussion of mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law and fathers and sons and that kind of thing. His expectation and demand for us is really pretty strenuous.
Oh, no, it's very strenuous. Yeah. So I was just going to, yeah. So he was saying that he's beginning to understand now, not just how society, just to put it in that term, could have enmity toward you, but how it could also lead to division within families, right? Is that a fair, yeah. And that Jesus really isn't, I remember Notre Dame would have, Holy Family Sunday and things like that, and the family of Notre Dame and the family of this, and I'm like, Jesus was not a family guy. He really wasn't. When his mother shows up in the Gospel of Matthew, and he's talking to his disciples, and they say, oh, your mother and your brothers want to see you. He goes, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And I used to tell my class, if I spoke like that with my mom in the hallway, oh man, yeah, smack. And what he says is, those who do the will of my Father in heaven are my mother and sisters and brothers, right? Not father, interestingly, though he leaves that one out. So it's a really good point that Jesus, listen to that. I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. And this is true, right? I don't know if I know people for whom this is definitely true, that they became convinced of a position, religious tradition that Jesus is teaching, and wanted to live that way, and their families were furious with them. And they might even have been good church-going people, right? But good church-going people don't tend to live this way. They usually don't even know Jesus told us to do these things because they don't hear about them. And so if you start living this way, then, oh my God, who do you think you are? You know, what are you doing to us? You're ruining our reputation, you know, this kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing, thank you for bringing that up. That's the kind of thing that you can understand if you've seen those dynamics at work, that a parent has these expectations of their child that are going right down the, you can imagine, you know, I'm voluntarily going to impoverish myself and let people beat me up and steal from me, et cetera. It's like, what are you doing? You know, so you can see why there would be this kind of enmity. And then that's what makes the command so striking, is when that happens, you love them, you do good to those who hate you, you bless those who curse you. They could be your parents or your siblings or your children, and you pray for those who mistreat you. So it isn't just when rulers haul you in, although that also happens, haul you in and, you know, persecute you and throw you in jail and try to kill you, et cetera. That's what, those aren't the only enemies he's talking about. They could be your sister. They could be your son. They could be your father. It could be very intensely personal. And so, but also then it could be more general than that. Yes. Yes, young lady.
About the part talks about disciples turning on each other.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about our current context within the Christian church and how being part of a denomination, for me, the United Church of Christ, that is often aligned with a particular political position. How I hear so much judgment about other Christians. And we do this a lot. They're real Christians. They're not real Christians, which is what we hear so often now. But seeing that is actually a sign of not a good sign. And how do we work against that tendency within our own traditions, which is very unpopular right now, as I know from personal experience. Try to talk about bringing people together under one tent is very unpopular conversation.
No, that's a really good question. And did everyone hear that? So how do we do it? The Christians are divided against each other. It really does. When I read that line preparing for this discussion, I was like, oh man, I hope we're not in the end days, because we're so far gone. Yeah, they will hate one another and betray one another, etc., and love will grow cold. So one of the things to think about then is, on the one hand, you have his concern to love not grow cold, and we obviously shouldn't hate each other. And on the other hand, he acknowledges that his coming is polarizing. He is a profoundly polarizing person. So we always say polarization is a bad thing. Well, Jesus didn't think so. He came to polarize, and he's an absolutist. You love him more than you love your parents. You love him more than you love your family. You love him more than you love your home. And you'll be willing to lose all of that for his sake. So he's claiming all of it, right? So on the one hand, he's polarizing. On the other hand, the way to overcome what we're in right now is to listen to what he's saying here and actually take it seriously. Judge not. Where do we get off judging other people, whether they're Christian? Have you ever looked at your life compared to what he's saying here? I mean, I'm really serious. If you look at this, I don't have time to judge anyone else. I am in so much trouble. I mean, daily, every minute, you know. So I would say, judge not lest ye be judged. Do not condemn or you will be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Love those who hate you. Do good to those who revile you, etc. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who hate you. Right? Praying for those. So in our liturgies, we could be praying for the people we'd otherwise be tempted, do we think hate us? And they might hate us, you don't know. But we should be praying for them and blessing them and forgiving them. And so, and loving them. So that's, I think the answer to that question is right here. And it's interesting, I'm jumping ahead several centuries, like several centuries, but Mahatma Gandhi was a Hindu, but he was very interested in truth, and he was interested in truth wherever he found it. And so he thought, well, maybe Christianity has something going on, but every Christian he met didn't look anything like this. they're, especially in India, if you converted to Christianity, you got to eat meat. And he's like, and drink alcohol. It's like, ooh, that's really attractive. These people are these paragons of virtue. They eat meat and drink wine with it and stuff. And then an evangelical in England gave him a Bible. And he started reading Genesis. He's like, I have no idea what's going on here. So I think I'll jump to the Gospel of Matthew. And he got 5 chapters into the Gospel of Matthew and hit the Sermon on the Mount and was blown away. He said these words went right into his heart. And he was so deeply impressed by what Jesus was saying that it was like, if you live this way, that's the truth. That's what, this is Gandhi now, this Hindu, right? And he always combined it with the Bhagavad Gita. But these words have this penetrating power that he then used in his resistance to British rule successfully, nonviolent resistance, right? So it isn't powerless. And he saw this, what Jesus is talking about here isn't just being a doormat. It's loving when people are hating you. And he said, that's the only way it's going to work. You love those who hate you. You bless those who curse you. It transforms everything. And it may not transform the other person. That person may hate you the rest of your life, but it holds the door open that may change. And anyway, so I think I really do think, I'm convinced of it, actually. This is the way to get out of the mess we're in. Listen to Jesus. And all of us claim to listen to him, and none of us are paying any attention to this section of his teaching. So yeah, I hope does that answer your question? Oh yeah, thank you.
I
Yes.
just want to say, it's kind of a newer thought to me, but like, I think it's mistaken for us to think we have the wisdom to know who our enemies are.
Right.
So we don't know who's against us or not. They might be against us behind the scenes, but be with us when they're in front of us.
Right.
Therefore, the only way to be sure is to follow
Right.
that sake of, I'm going to pray for everybody.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know who's against me.
Right.
And the truth is, I think about, I love the powerful story in Acts of Paul and Silas being in prison. And after being beaten, they're singing hymns.
Right.
And that converts people, you know, that love of their
Mhm.
situation, not their circumstances, but their love of what they have when they had nothing else, is so powerful that even their clear enemies are just being baptized in front of them,
Mhm.
which I think is like that. To me, that's just such a powerful example and a real happening.
Oh no, it's real.
It's not parable. It's like this is an action mode. And to me, it's like that's the one way I feel like I can be sure is if I'm praying for everybody, then I'm not missing anybody.
Right. No, that's a really, really, really good point. And also the rejoicing in the midst of suffering. You're absolutely right. One of the things that just blew the contemporaries of the Christians away was they rejoiced when they suffered for the sake of Christ. And if you have the capacity to have joy in the midst of what most of us would consider to be crushing misery, people want that. Like, where does that come from? Where do you find the ability to rejoice when everyone else is just desperate? So, and also the other cool thing from that story, I think it's in that story, but it's in one of them, when the angel comes and the jail is open and they get out, the jailer's terrified because he's going to be killed for letting them out. And they assure him immediately, no. They basically go back in the cell so they won't wind up having him be killed. So the mercy for the person who was jailing them was also all of this stuff that we're talking about is what attracted people to Christianity. And it still does. It's just that we don't see very much of it anymore. And we don't hear very much of it anymore. And so my own thought, and Carrie brought this up, and I really think it's true. And that's one of the reasons when we were talking about Forum, we wanted to do this theme in particular, because you can't get a better theme. First of all, this is core to Christianity. Like, if you want to be a Christian, this is the handbook. And secondly, it couldn't be a better time in the life of our churches than to think about these things. Because if we do think about these things and evaluate our life in relation to them, we don't have time to start going, oh, but what about her? What about them? It's like, what about me? Do I look anything like this? Or like the book of Acts is beautiful. Those stories are incredible. It's like, I don't look like that. I'm complaining about cold weather. This is pathetic. So anyway, really, really good questions though. So I realized our time, I can't believe we didn't run over. We're right up to the time. So yeah, that's Mel just said, those are microcosms of the kingdom. I do think that's right. When that happens, that's why Jesus says the kingdom is now. Because that joy in the midst of suffering, that love in the midst of hatred, that praying when you really want to belt them, right? That's what the kingdom of heaven looks like. And it can look like that here. But it's so odd when it shows up here. It's like, where did that come from? So good point, though. Good point. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much.